Hi everyone, good morning to all. My name is Marta. I'm with Marlene moderating this fourth session of panel 1 on energy consumption and well-being, and we would like to welcome you to this session. We hope you are having a great conference. This new format online is quite different. We would very much like to be in Etière with you and at least see you, because we're not able to see you, which is quite annoying. This morning we'll have new approaches from the ground up, citizen engagement. We have with us Jenny Palm, Halitza, Iteva and Andrew Reeves, which will bring presentations focused on how to engage users and people. Just for you to know, and perhaps you know, I noticed that this morning there are several sessions addressing the role of people and how to engage people in different energy dimension. So I'm so happy that people is in the agenda and we are looking at people in a different way. Without further ado, I would like to call Jenny to begin her presentation on exploring energy citizenship in relation to district heating. Jenny, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Jenny Palm and I'm at Lund University, Sweden, and I will present a project that I have together with Amy Ambrose at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. It's about energy citizenship in relation to district heating, and it's a project funded by the Swedish Energy Agency. The project is called Walking with Energy, and the aim with the project is to develop methods to facilitate a discussion on how to engage a broad public in reflection on how we produce and consume heat and if that is sustainable. We have so far been able to conduct 9 walks, and here you can see some photos from some of them. What you can see is when we were visited an elderly care center here in Sweden. We did a tour to a heat exchanger in the basement of our institute's building. And we also had a guided tour to a heating production plant in Sheffield. And you also can see the minutes before we will start one of our virtual events that we have had. Of the 9 walks that we have conducted so far, 3 have been online events. In this presentation, I will talk about the results from 4 of the events. In Sheffield, we managed to conduct a physical walk and had a guided tour of Sheffield's energy from waste facility, where the city's refuse is burned to generate both heat and electricity. The walk took place pre-COVID and formed part of a popular science event called the Festival of Social Science, and it's organized by the UK Research Council. At this event, we worked as a group along the 1.5 kilometer of the district heating pipeline that runs around Sheffield city centre. And we ended up at the energy from waste plant and had a tour inside there. In this walk, we had 15 participants, mainly white middle class, and they were between 24 and 85 years old. They were rather well educated and had a professional background. Another version of the walk was tried out in Sweden during something called the Future Week, organized by the Lund University. The general public was invited to the IIIE building, a beautiful ancient building, and in there we had a presentation of the City of Lund's heating system and the building's heat exchanger. We had 8 participants, and these were mainly homeowners interested in house renovation and to learn more about how to adjust the heating system at home. They were middle and low income and between 27 and 70 years old. In an attempt to reach a wider audience, we contacted a socioeconomic challenged area in the city of Malmö in Sweden. This is an area where the city actively works with the immigrants and their integration into the society. So we had contact with the municipal area manager for this area, and it was him that distributed an invitation to different citizen representatives in this area. The idea was to meet in the city hall in the area and walk to the heat production plant that is near there. When the day came, the people attending were all from the same language cafe for immigrants. It was 5 women and their teacher, also a woman. The women attending this event had not fully understood the information about the event and were not willing to walk to the plant because they didn't feel it was secure to do this. They were, however, willing to participate in a group interview. So then we decided to delete the walk and just conduct a focus group interview. We don't know the exact age of these women, but we estimate that they were all between 20 and 50 years old. When COVID-19 arrived, we needed to find new methods, and we have therefore tried out virtual walks. The virtual walk was part that I will talk about here was part of the same event as the walk through the waste facility. So it was the same festival, but a year after, and then the whole festival was run online. At this event, we had made a movie, or it was made by Marilyn Smith and her organization Enact. They filmed a waste incineration plant located in Malmö, Sweden. And in this film, the audience can follow how the heat is produced and also how the heat is distributed to a family's radiators. After the film, a panel was invited to discuss pros and cons with district heating and waste as a fuel. Thereafter, we had a conversation with the audience. The event had 54 participants, and they were all, mainly students between 20 and 30 years old. If looking at what was discussed during the events, so the event triggered similar discussions, and those are the ones highlighted in colors here. And the black ones to the right are unique themes for the specific event. And the theme discussed is no real surprise for us, but it concerns emissions, recycling, heating system, waste incineration, and pricing and profit of different heating systems. The walk through the heat facility had the most focused and less diversified reflections, which we think can be explained by the direct and physical contact the participants experience with the production plant, which made them keep attentions to issues related to the infrastructure and the technology and related institutions. The other walks included more discussion related to behaviors and heating practices, and this is most likely because the visualizations raised more connotations to home and the home's heating system. If we're looking at some typical reaction from the events, a typical reaction from the walk through the plant was that there were a combination of discomfort at the volume and nature of the waste gathered from the city, and a degree of reassurance that it was being put to good use. So this one is saying, personally seeing all the waste is quite a sobering thing, coming face to face with the consequences of our overconsumption, seeing all waste pouring into a pit like that. All walks resulted in a lot of reflections, and sometimes they were surprising for us. For example, this person is saying, it's interesting, it's just that this with all these concepts, for me, I'm not an engineer, I don't know this, and it's gas and natural gas and hydropower from Holland. And why she's doing this reflection with the hydropower from Holland is not clear for us, because Sweden does not import hydropower or any power from the Netherlands, and we don't discuss that during this tour. So why she started to reflect about this is not so clear for us, but interesting still. And we don't have much gas either. We discuss gas during this tour because we have had it before, and we have some gas still in the system locally here in this region, but it's not emphasized. So it's interesting that this is what she remember from the talk. But also the continuation of this quote is also interesting because it shows that we have some kind of social learning involved in all our walks actually. But this is a good example, I think. So this is the quote continue. This person continued by saying that. Then he, and referring to the researcher, the guide, probably misunderstood me because I don't have electricity heating. I have such a regular, what is it called? It is called water heating. Then another participant jumped in and said, but then you probably have an immersion heater inside it. And then she says, yes, you think. And then they continue to discuss this. So this shows that they also share reflection and can educate each other in a way. In the language cafe, we lacked the common language, so we needed to use our mobile phones a lot and show each other what we meant and what we asked and the responses. The most interesting part in this walk is that we reach out to people we usually don't reach out to in our project. And I think we learned a lot about the different heating system in different countries, and also how to communicate through those pictures and through our mobile phones. And I think it worked well. And yeah, you can see the picture here on a stove from one of the women's home countries. And we could have a discussion around that, even if we didn't have a common language, which was interesting. The virtual walks have attracted many participants, as expected, I guess. The walks are quite easily accessed if you just have the right equipment. It has also have a slightly different form. The online event gives the possibility to share links to tweets, report, blogs, etc. in the chat. So what is happening at these walks, I think, is similar to all other online events, is that we got kind of two ongoing conversation, one oral and one written. So while we have the presentation and ongoing and we're showing the film, at the same times we as the researcher, the invited panelists and the participant can contribute quite easily in the chat with our own reflection and insights while this other meeting in a way is ongoing. An example of that is shown here, where a participant starting to pose a question, and then another participant pose another question. And first, Amy, my colleague, responded to the first question, and then Marilyn, who was who was sharing the session this time, responded to the second question. So then this is how it goes on during these walks. So the virtual walks contributed to many participants, and it definitely has increased the number of young participants in our events. Still, we have reflected about that it has been a quite mainstream group when it comes to education and professional background. And I think we need to further investigate how to attract a more diversified group on these virtual events also. So some concluding thoughts so far into the project. These works that we have done are acts of research participation, and as such they contribute to fostering citizens who are active and aware, and we're also empowering individuals to take active part in the heating market and in policy making. And this is done at the same time as we collect data to our research on energy citizenship. And it is important to make citizens part of the transition process and re-engage them in both heating production and consumption. This is, however, not a straightforward process. There are so many barriers for citizens to become active in these processes. In the project, there has not been easy to identify and motivate people to participate in our walks. We have needed to spend much time to identify good events to participate in, get access to these events, engage different heating plot owners, and also to market our events to potential participants. So it takes a lot of time. And then when the walks, during the walks, we also are in need of several researchers to lead and facilitate the group conversations or the chat, and we also need a professional from the energy companies to conduct the walk and go through the plants and explain how the processes are functioning and the technology and all that. So that also needs people in these walks, and we also need the panelists to bring in their different perspective on the heating system as a facilitation of the discussions with the citizen. So we can conclude that energy citizenship requires not only active citizens, but also active facilitation that gives citizens the possibility to engage and reflect about their heating experiences. Thanks for listening, and here is the context to me and to Amy if you got any questions in the future. But thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Perhaps you can turn your camera. Yes, thank you so much. We have already questions for you, which is fantastic. The first one from Ralitza, and she asks, what have you learned from these walks that otherwise have been hidden through using other methods?
I think what we benefit as researcher from these walks is that we actually can engage citizens more on an informal basis. My experience, but coming as a researcher, then people start to think and they are happy to share, but they want to share the correct answers in a way. And I think that these kinds of walks, then they become more relaxing and we can have this in more informal chat. So what we benefit, I think, is that we can have people's instant reflections on things. So we have so many interesting but surprising comments that I have never experienced when I'm doing this more formal interview. And I think I have more these kinds of expected responses, but in this we could just write an article on everything strange that is said during this work, and I think that's a fantastic, and so that is what I think is we benefit from this.
The second and the third question are more or less the same. Basically, what we are asking is, how was this discussion conducted? How were the topics raised? What influenced participants to raise those topics? What kind of biases, influences were generated, for example, by the background of participants? So how was this discussion conducted?
Yes, and this is in a way a problem in this project. We have this interview guide where we have questions that we post to all groups, but they are also very unstructured in the way that we are letting the participant reflect upon whatever they want to reflect upon. And then, of course, so for example, when we have this event, when we discuss the heat exchanger, then it was very biased because it was homeowners and they have an own agenda with coming there. And we think that's great because one of the purpose with the project is to engage. And then we need to start with the questions that the participants have, not only in our own questions. But of course, that is, I don't know if it's a problem. It depends on what aim you want to fulfill. If you want to have this research aim where you want to conclude something intelligent and new, or if you want to focus on this, but the importance of engaging people in the heating system. And that's two quite different aims. I think that we have had more focus on the aim to engage, and then we just go with whatever happens.
Whatever comes.
Yeah.
Katerina Heindel is asking if you found different knowledge or interests between age groups.
Yes, we have, absolutely. And I think especially because we have the young people and we have the elderly people, and the elderly people, they can reflect more on the transition process over time, of course. So they are doing that a lot when we are talking with them. So we are more in the history when talking with them, and they have another kind of knowledge, I would say, than the young people that is very much forward looking and are more looking into, if the young people are looking into how new innovative ways to change in the future, the elderly people are looking back and saying that, yeah, but we know a lot. We can use the historical knowledge to go forward. And that, I think, is one of the reflections that we have made. And that is interesting to compare, actually.
Jake Barnes is asking, is engaging people easier or more challenging in electricity systems or in heating systems?
Oh, that's such an interesting question, because we have so difficult in engaging Swedish people in this, because we have district heating in Sweden. And I think that people think it's so boring. But in the UK, for example, it has been a much bigger interest for these events. And also we have had from African countries that have contacted us and wants to have those kinds of talks. So it really depends on the location. But in Sweden, we have struggled to try to get people engaged.
The final question, but perhaps one of the biggest and most important, is based on this experience, what are your policy recommendations?
Oh, I think that it's so important actually to have this citizen engagement. And I think that still among the policymakers, they are not really taking this serious enough. And I think that at the national level, they are perhaps thinking that it's just a barrier to need to involve people. But to have this transition, I think that we need engaged people, and we need also a practical experience among the people. So even if everyone knows how the heat is produced in Sweden, for example, they have not experienced that. And just that kind of experience will make them change things practically. And I think that is quite ignored in policymaking. I think we must engage people much more and realize that, no, it's not enough with those great information campaigns. We need to go in there and talk with people in small groups. And that, I think, we have confirmed in this project as well.
Just to close the discussion, Andrew Reeves is saying that perhaps more important than research method, these techniques are important to keep academics close to people and close to reality. What do you think?
Yes, and I think I very much think so, but that was also what I ended with, because we also need to realize that this is a very costly project. It takes a lot of man hours and a lot of time from everyone involved, but I have difficult to see how we can do it in another way, actually. But I think it's so important for policymakers, but also for us as researchers to engage in this, because it is important to engage citizens.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for your presentation, for your answers, and for this discussion. We need to move on to Relitza, which brings us a talk about borrowing, energy demand, and COVID, a model for disruption. The floor is yours, Relitza.
Thank you very much. I just want to take the first 30 seconds and really sincerely thank both Marta and Marlene about organizing this session, because for us it had an anticipated turn, positive one, and that is for a project that was entirely conducted within COVID, and it was kind of hijacked by the COVID agenda. Your framing of well-being came as an unexpected but quite useful way to talk about energy demand and borrowing. So thank you very much. So This particular study was done within CREDS, which is a UK-based Centre for Energy Research on Energy Demand Solutions. Tim Foxon and I, who are authors of this paper, we represent the Digital Society theme, which is led out of University of Sussex. The specific things that we studied in terms of borrowing was the Library of Things, and it's a very specific community-based model for borrowing, which started in Crystal Palace, which is one of the neighborhoods in London. The reason this was of particular interest to us is because a Library of Things is one of the type of models which is growing the fastest in the UK. So the UK has traditionally had some pockets such as Bristol, Exeter and Cambridge and Oxford, who are very interested in Library of Things and have had Library of Things for many years, but they were offline. So these were places where you can actually go and borrow someone's equipment. The Library of Things model, however, is quite specific because it's an online model. That is, that the way in which the Library of Things engages with the community within which it operates is through a lot of targeted social media and specifically designed digital platforms for borrowing, which are entirely focused on what kind of borrowing journey they offer to people. So, as I mentioned earlier, this project, oh, here you go. So as I mentioned earlier, this project examines the connections between energy demand and the particular model of Library of Things borrowing and analyzed through the lens of well-being. Specifically here, we seek to ask questions about how does energy demand manifest, and it's shaped in the way borrowing is organized, and to what extent do we have interlinkages between energy demand and borrowing, and how they were actually disrupted, if at all, by the COVID pandemic. By asking these questions and framing the study in such a way, we're engaging and contributing to understanding of how do we expand the ways in which we talk about energy demand, that is, we address its narrowness, and how do we talk about the invisibility of energy demand, which is useful in us understanding how seemingly very positive models such as borrowing could hide certain elements of energy demand in a way which might not be quite sustainable or useful. So a Library of Things model is a very feel-good story. So it involves significant, meaningful and effective relationships, which are based around shared experiences and interest, and it's usually used as a way to empower communities and serve as a vehicle for wider social change, emancipation, and solidarity. And the Library of Things model very actively promotes a set of environmental benefits, social benefits, and economic benefits. For example, they constantly emphasize the fact that borrowing is more sustainable use of resources, that's avoiding of landfill, that you can actually borrow to upcycle, which is something that happened quite a lot during the first 2 lockdowns in the UK. There are less associated carbon emissions. It's cheaper to rent something than to buy it. And they make big claims about how borrowing could be at the heart of community building and could actively contribute to that. One of the other reasons why we decided to look at borrowing in the Library of Things is because of the significance that electrical items actually have for this particular model. Before COVID, the Library of Things would lend about 50 different items. Some of them were so popular, such as carpet cleaners and pressure washers, that they'll have multiple items of. And during COVID, when they had to have a restricted service, you'll be able to borrow up to 15 different items. The interesting thing here is electrical items presented something like 80% of all borrowing before COVID, and this actually intensified and increased during the pandemic. So there were more electrical items that were being borrowed. And the big claim here is that electrical waste is one of the fastest growing waste streams into the world, and its environmental impact is something that is often compared to that of plastics by the Library of Things. So very quickly, energy demand. Here we were focusing particularly on widening understanding of energy demand by examining, mediating infrastructures and practices, particularly the practices of well-being. And that is how people are being able to cope with problems and crises in life, and the extent to which they're interested and involved in things that happens in one's life. And here, for the purposes of this paper, we have utilized a very light touch of something known as ABC framework to think about well-being, which is focused on acting, belonging, and committing. And these represent a hierarchy for increasing levels of involvement and contributions to well-being. The interesting thing here around the community-based model of borrowing is that it has several distinctive elements which make it community-based. First of all, it's carried out through local partnerships. For example, the very first Crystal Palace-based Library of Things was in the Norwood Library in Crystal Palace. There is a direct and sustained engagement with local borrowers. If you go onto their social media accounts, you will see that there is a constant posting of pictures and celebrating what people have achieved by borrowing certain items. There's also an empowerment and education agenda with Library of Things engagement and social media being focused on explaining to people about the benefits of borrowing. The environmental benefits are almost entirely framed in terms of the savings which are possible through borrowing rather than buying and owning things. There's also a lot of support activities, such as the running of maintenance and repair cafes where people can volunteer to learn how to repair and maintain some of the items that are being lent. Also, Library of Things relied heavily on volunteers during the Things on Wheels trial, which happened during the pandemic, where they switched from people being able to go to the library and borrow directly from one of their kiosks to volunteers running a service where they collect and deliver items that people have borrowed. As I mentioned previously, there is significant focus on the borrowing and particularly the customer journey, which means that there is the kind of the organizing logic is about the quality of the borrowing experience, and that has direct implications for energy demand. For example, a lot of the electric items, such as carpet cleaners and pressure washers, are industrial strength ones, ones that people are unlikely to purchase if they were purchasing for their own home, but they are quite energy intensive, and it's known that they will give a quite good borrowing experience to people. Another key element of the community-based model of borrowing used by the Library of Things is the claim that they actually contribute to the local community by their own calculations. For every £10 that local people are spending to borrow something, with them £8.50 stays local, and it helps to create jobs for people in the community. So since we started working with the Library of Things, they have expanded to 4 new locations within London, and in each of these locations they have hired positions such as Things Wizards. So these are the people who maintain and repair the items that are being borrowed, and community energizers. So these are people whose job specifically is to work with the local community in local partnerships, sustain engagement, empowerment, and education agenda. So the interesting thing is one of the first things that we did during the pandemic was a big survey where we asked questions about the drivers for borrowing, and we discovered that the majority of people borrow because of the associated savings and cost, because they need to carry out an activity, and to a small extent, in third place, because they were concerned about the environmental impact of buying an item, which is not being used most of the time. So this is, I think, an interesting distinction that we have to focus on. So this is particular phrasing that the Library of Things uses in order to promote its environmental services. What we did find, quite surprisingly, is that the cost of energy that an item uses, or how much energy an item uses, does not influence the majority of borrowers' decisions on whether to borrow something or not, or how frequently they would borrow an item. Only a small percentage of the borrowers said that they would think about whether they borrow something, how they use it, or how frequently they borrow it because of the cost of energy. So only 10% of the survey respondents were inclined to avoid borrowing items which needed to have their batteries charged before being returned or used. And this is an important part which I need to emphasize. So previously, before the start of the pandemic, all the items that were being borrowed were charged at the kiosk in the Library of Things. And when someone will go and pick it up, they will have something which is ready to go. So the battery will be fully charged, and there was no requirement for them to return it with a fully charged battery. However, during the pandemic, when the library closed, Library of Things had to actually physically move out their activities from a big yellow storage unit where they did not have access to electricity and water, and they were not able to borrow, they were not able to charge batteries. So a requirement of participating in the borrowing of the Things on Wheels trial was that people had to return items, electrical items that they borrowed with fully charged batteries. And this was an interesting element for us because it meant that there was a higher energy requirement on people who were borrowing. What we did find, however, when we examined both models of borrowing before and during the pandemic, is that energy demand was quite invisible in the whole borrowing journey. So there was a limited information on charging and battery usage at the home, such as the model of the batteries or how to charge the batteries optimally. There was no information on the average energy use of the item or advice on how to reduce this. So this kind of information about how an item is used is actually a big part of the borrowing journey for Library of Things, and they have invested a lot of time and resources to develop guides that would help different types of borrowers to work quickly and efficiently with equipment they might not have encountered before. The cost of energy was also hidden for the Library of Things themselves. As I said, their kiosk was located within a library. They paid rent, and in that rent was included all the bills that they needed. So they had no idea how much energy they were using for charging things or in the process of maintaining or repair. However, during COVID, there was, with them moving their their operations into the big yellow storage unit, there was an opportunity for the energy demand and the energy that was being used to become more visible for them. Through the fact that they had to now interact with people and ask them to charge things at home and charge batteries. However, what we did find is that energy demand remained an invisible part of the borrowing journey. And this is where the kind of understanding of well-being plays an important role. This is very well illustrated by one of the borrowers who explained that they don't think about energy. They think about, when they think about borrowing an item, they think about how much that cost per day to borrow. And you might try to think to use an item as quickly as possible, but you never think about how much energy it uses or how much that costs.
Let's say you need to wrap up.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Right. So the interesting element here of borrowing is that it was strongly linked with well-being. So it was linked in the way that people talk about that they're aware of the need to use extra energy. But they saw that being asked to charge things was the communal and right thing to do. So even when they were worried about how much that would cost, they'll still do it because they thought that that means that they belong to a community, they cared about other people. They also talked about the fact that borrowing was really helpful for them to think about their own well-being, and then allowed them to take care of things that bother them while they sit at home, such as a stain on the carpet that they would not have otherwise bothered to do anything about. Borrowing was an important way to keep getting on with things and keeping oneself busy, referring to looking after their own well-being. So the interesting conclusions here is that borrowing enabled different ways of keeping going and fighting negative feelings of being helpless and idle during the pandemic. It increased well-being in many ways of people borrowing to cope with the new demands of spending more time inside their homes and enable them to look after others. There were mentions of people who would borrow things in order to make shared and communal areas better for everybody in their local community. However, that led to the shrouding of the associated energy use in a positive light, just as that quote about the person who thought that charging a battery for someone else to use was the communal and right thing to do. So despite energy demand becoming more visible to both the Library of Things and borrowers during the pandemic, it did not actually lead to any changes within how the Library of Things operate in terms of energy demand, or how people actually treated the items, or what drove what they borrowed and how frequently. Our lasting thing is that this powerful linkage between borrowing, well-being and energy demand could be used to develop really more just community-based models of borrowing and a better understanding of the environmental benefits which are associated with it. There is a lot of quotes and a walk-by-walk steps in explaining the different elements of linkages between well-being and borrowing in the presentation slides and in the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Relitza. We have already a lot of questions, so we need to speed up a little bit. Noam Bergman is asking you, what are the motivations of people running the Library of Things? Is it the business, an NGO? What are the implications of this kind of organization in energy demand? What are their interests?
Yeah, I mean, they have evolved since they were first established, and they have attempted to run this entirely not for profit. However, currently they do run it as a social enterprise, which is for profit. And they find that this is one of the best ways that they have seen in which they can provide the type of equipment that people want to borrow. Their main driver is to get more people into borrowing, and particularly to borrow locally.
Question related to that comes from John Rollett. He says, to increase client base, have they considered moving to a full product service system in which citizens pay a flat fee and can borrow anything they wish for a 2 days period, as potentially the reduction in products manufactured as the greater impact rather than the direct electric usage saving?
I know that they are in discussions with the manufacturers of the items that most borrow, such as carpet cleaners. You just wouldn't imagine how much borrowing during the pandemic was about carpet cleaners. I mean, that's why.
We can imagine.
No, it really was
were
about
at home.
cleaners.
We were at home.
Yeah, I mean, so everything was organized around how easily you can actually deliver and collect carpet cleaners during a pandemic. However, currently what they are working with manufacturers is to understand what type of industrial strength machinery will work best with the borrowing model that they have. And as far as we know, they're not looking to actually change the borrowing model. It is quite successful. They have attempted to do this in at least 3 different ways in the past, and this is the one where they see actually a financially sustainable model, which allows them to do the community engagement and outreach.
Yeah, Karsten is asking if the increased borrowing through pandemic is due to the fact that the same people just borrow more frequently, or if there have been many new first-time borrowers.
I can answer this because we were actually able, working with the Library of Things, we're able to see who were borrowing. And what we actually have seen is that there were about 25% increase in new borrowers. And this was due to the fact that in the past, people might have been prevented from borrowing because they had to physically go to the Library of Things and pick up things. What we did find is there were a lot of elderly borrowers who previously, if they didn't drive, they wouldn't want to borrow heavy things such as the carpet cleaners again, because they'll have to use public transport or a taxi. But the fact that during the pandemic, the Library of Things started borrowing collections and pickups from people's homes meant that more people actually started to use it, and they were almost exclusively interested in borrowing carpet cleaners.
One last question. I will ask you though to go through all the comments that we have here in Zoom and perhaps answering in the WOVA session because we got a bit late. Andrew Reeves is asking regarding the visibility of energy, isn't the key issue more an awareness of embodied energy rather than in-use energy? And similarly, minimizing end-of-life waste?
Yeah, I mean, we specifically wanted to focus on something which was not about the kind of the life cycle use of energy, because we specifically wanted to talk about the narrowness in terms of what we consider to be important elements of energy demand and the invisibility. So as I said, we're grateful to the link with wellbeing because this is an excellent example of the type of practices which tell us about a lot about energy demand and the borrowing models for the Library of Things and how people feel about it within their homes. That would have become invisible if it wasn't for the focus on well-being. I think Tim wants to say something as well.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as co-author on the paper, just thanks for the useful comments from everyone. I mean, just on Andrew's point, I mean, clearly, yes, the reduction in the embodied energy is the most important environmental benefit, but it's sort of framed in terms of reducing waste, which is something that people can conceptualize, and I think what we're seeing is that people. Even the in-use energy is sometimes difficult for people to conceptualize. So the sort of embodied energy is maybe even a step further in terms of difficulty for people to understand, or conceptualize what embodied energy means, other than in terms of the framing, in terms of reducing waste. So so we sort of recognise, and we're going to sort of go on and look at more at the life cycle, but in this paper, we want to look more at the in-use energy demand. Thanks.
Rolita, I would like just to call your attention, and of Teams, of course. Marlene left a comment that perhaps well-being is a sense, when you said that borrowing is related to well-being, perhaps the borrowing makes people part of a community. And that's the relationship. I don't know if Marlene wants to comment.
Yeah, sure. It just struck me
Thank
that, even more so during the pandemic, seems like people really needed to connect in this way. They had practical reasons, but they probably felt that they were also part of something, an imagined community. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. And if I can ask, can you tell me again what the C is in ABC?
Act, belong, and connect.
Okay, all right. And who's that from? You can put it in the chat.
Yeah,
did you-
I can give the reference as well.
Okay,
I just wanted to say that I had to go very quickly through maybe the most interesting part of the paper, but absolutely, I think you're absolutely right. What we did find quite interestingly is that volunteers who did the delivery and collection through the Things on Wheels trial, they were the ones that were given an opportunity to borrow something for free for their service. And a lot of them said that they were not able to borrow so far because they were made redundant due to the pandemic. So a lot of them were performing artists and a lot of them were people who were working in catering, which were industries that came to a standstill. So for them, borrowing, even if it was free, it was associated with an extra cost. For example, one of them talked about pasta makers, but you still have to buy the additional ingredients to make the pasta, even if you don't pay for the pasta makers. But nonetheless, they volunteered for the Library of Things because it helped them fight the feeling of being idle and help them think of themselves as part of the community. And that was a very important element of their well-being. So they felt they contributed and they felt that, they were not completely isolated in this.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank you all the speakers and all the participants for the fantastic questions. Let's proceed to the next presenter, Andrew Reeves, which brings a talk on ICT in context, co-designing energy efficiency ICT-based interventions from the ground up.
Hello and welcome to our short presentation on the eTeacher project. This is a project looking at saving energy in a range of buildings across Europe that we've developed through a co-design approach with the end users of the ICT-based app that we've been developing. The work that I'm reporting on has been led by my colleague Ashley Morton. My name is Andrew Reeves. We're both from De Montfort University. We've been working with Richard Bull from Nottingham Trent University and other people from across the project team. So I'll give you an insight into what we're looking at to start with by just inviting you to imagine something. So imagine the place you work. Now, for many of you, a year or two ago, this would have been an office. Right now, it could well be your home. That's fine. But think about any energy inefficiency issues that may come up where you are. So that could be issues of overheating. That could be lights being left on when they're not needed or otherwise. Now, would you install an app on your phone or go to a web page to get information and have interactions that might help you reduce these problems? Like, would you actually do that? And if you would, what would you actually want to get out of that? What functions would you look for, in terms of learning, in terms of keeping you engaged and interested to actually help you save energy? So that's the kind of end user perspective on what we've been doing. We've been looking to develop an app that will achieve that goal of saving energy in buildings, but in a way that motivates and engages the users of those buildings. So how might we think about this? So we've been working on behavior change issues. That's what we were bringing to this project. So one way you can think about that is through the COMBI model, a framework for thinking about behavior change that highlights that human behavior is linked to our capability, psychological and physical, our opportunity to act, whether that's the physical environment or the social environment that might enable or disable our efforts, and our motivation to actually do something, whether that's conscious or unconscious. So an app could motivate or motivate more through some sort of gamification approach. Lots of projects have successfully used that before. It could enhance the social opportunity, so you could connect people together within a building to talk with each other or to share information with them. It could also enhance capability, or at least make sure that the behaviors you want people to do are things that are actually doable for them, that within their agency. So these are some of the ways we were thinking about it behaviorally. And in terms of the process, we were using a user-centered design approach. So actually engaging with the people who would be using the app over several years to ensure that what we did was relevant, usable, something they'd be motivated to do, basically. So that was our thinking to kind of ground this project. And so just a bit of information about the project. So eTeacher, it's a Horizon 2020 project, so with partner organizations across Europe. It's about energy efficiency and behavior change in buildings. And a range of interventions. So I'm highlighting the kind of user experience of a phone app or a web-based app, but there's also other stuff going on behind the scenes for the case study buildings we're working with, installing enhanced monitoring equipment around temperature or measures of thermal comfort to kind of feed data into the application. We were testing it in 12 buildings in 3 countries across Europe. So in Spain, 2 healthcare centres, 2 schools, a residential building and an office. In the UK, a school and an office, and in Romania, 4 residential tower blocks. So the idea was we test it in these spaces, get feedback, and then hopefully we have something that is valuable that can be deployed further in the future. So I said we were using a user-centered approach. So a way you could define this is through the double diamond design stages, which are used by the British Design Council, and that aligns with the approach we used, which was building upon something called changeology, a framework put forward by Les Robinson. So if I just go through the stages, discover is about kind of identifying the challenge and seeing what different user needs there are. So it's an expansive phase, highlighting lots of different issues that then takes you down through the define stage, where you go towards a specific design brief and seeing how what you can offer aligns with the problems that users may face. And then you might develop what you're doing, which again could be expansive as you test different solutions, and then again deliver, where you focus in on the specific solution you've come up with. And in terms of what we did in this project, early on in the discover phase, as a project team, we visited each of these buildings we're working with, spoke to different stakeholders in those buildings to understand what was going on. We ran workshops with the users of those buildings, Workshop Ask, and also workshops with the partners in the project to see what they could offer. So those are called Workshop Bridge. And then following the changeology approach, we ran a series of feedback forums, essentially to explore what the building users, what their needs were, what their understandings were in relation to energy use, how they would respond to the ideas we had around an app, to help us define it, develop it, and then ultimately to evaluate what we did. What I'm reporting here is just what we did in the define stage. We have actually pretty much delivered this project already, but the focus of the presentation here is what learning we got from the define stage. So what we did in this stage, we ran a series of co-design workshops. So we had 8 sessions with users from 11 of our 12 pilot buildings taking part. There were small sessions, so between 3 and 11 people attended each one, so 48 all in. And they were facilitated locally, in person, with the materials translated, originally developed in English and translated for delivery in Spain and Romania. What we explored in these workshops were 5 issues through 5 linked activities. So we asked people to think about their ideal app for the functions we've discussed in an interactive way, playing with stickers and a phone template. And there was discussion around what would actually work well for that particular type of building and for the particular end users. We looked at the information that could be presented and the functions of the app. And again, this was exploring a kind of predetermined menu, but again, having discussion to follow that up. We put forward different ideas for hints that could be offered to users around energy saving and got feedback around that. We looked at different ways of visualizing data within the app and what would be visualized, and again got feedback. And finally, we got people's views on whether missions or goals or challenges could be embedded within the app. So the sort of thing you do in a gamification approach. Now, I'm not going to have time here to report back on all these things, but you could look at the supporting paper if you want to learn a bit more about what we did for those activities. So just to summarize a few findings. So in terms of the ideal app, the graph here kind of illustrates the percentage of participants who were interested in different things. The most popular thing was essentially information, particularly information about indoor temperature, but also environmental quality. So people wanted to know what was happening in their space. And in particular, people with a professional role in relation to the building, so energy managers, they wanted a chance to dig even deeper into that data. So maybe looking room by room at what was going on. There's also interest in hints and the chance to give feedback, just about how you feel in a space. I feel too warm, I feel too cold. That was one idea we had. And also just to report problems. If there's a problem, being able to report that using the tool and get that acted upon was a popular idea. Interestingly, for us, the social networks and the gamification elements were not very popular at all. So the people we engaged with weren't interested in that in terms of the ideal app discussion. We built upon that by looking at specific functions that the app could do. So again, people responded to that. So the image you see is how people rank these things from very important to unimportant or not applicable. And what you can see here, the most popular things were at the bottom. So again, that information and data based upon the enhanced monitoring and metering we were going to install was by far the most important thing in the view of the users. And there was a distinction there between type of buildings. So in homes and offices, people were interested in kind of room level data because people will inhabit particular rooms, in those spaces and have that particular relationship. Whereas schools and health centres, it was often whole building level that people were more interested in. Again, the least important things in people's views were those gamification elements, so a chance to interact socially, to post on social media, to get rewards for carrying out particular behaviours. That wasn't seen as very important for most of the people we engaged with. A few other comments around some of the other functions we explored in terms of hints. So hints and reminders around particular issues you might engage with each day were appreciated. So things like thermostat settings or a reminder to turn off particular appliances. Although we did have some feedback around that, in so much as it must be appropriate for the building type and the agency of people within those buildings to actually act upon a hint. So, for example, there was an option of a reminder about how you'd set up a washing machine, but many of these buildings didn't actually have washing machines, so it would be inappropriate to offer that guidance in that building. Or you may be offering guidance around a thermostat, but in several of our buildings, the people who worked in them didn't have control over the thermostat. In fact, the thermostat was kind of sealed off from the users of the building and controlled remotely by an energy manager. So that was a frustration to be given a prompt about something you couldn't control. So at least having the option to kind of quickly dismiss that and not be offered that again was something that was seen as helpful here. In terms of what was visualized, there was most interest in visualizations around energy use, whether that was whole building or kind of more personal level around a particular space people occupied. And again, least interest in visualizations and links to social media profiles. So that's just a quick tour of some of the things we found through these workshops. So just some discussion of some of the main things that came up. Interestingly, a lot of more interested in information than the gamified elements that we'd imagined would be a big feature of what we did. Now, this could well be just that for most users that is a general thing, but we should also have in mind that it's fairly likely that the sample of people we engaged with could be biased in some way to either having a personal interest, care in energy issues or sustainability, or a professional interest in managing energy in those spaces. So it could be that we were missing a kind of a wider cohort of people who would need that enhanced motivation through gamification. So we can't be certain around that, but certainly our data set give us information, and that will help us. Users' roles and agency. So this point around many people didn't have access to controls for heating and cooling or lighting or whatever it may be, and so making sure that the functions of an app actually relate to what people are able to do was important. Accessibility as well. So this is a broader design point, but something we hadn't anticipated. But in schools, for example, students aren't allowed to use smartphones, or at least in the schools we looked at, nor are the staff. And so you need a platform you can access through a web page for it to be actually accessible to many of those building users. These points taken together, one person, they said that they were interested in a different priority-based pattern depending upon job role of how you would navigate through this app. So someone who is an energy manager wouldn't necessarily see the same things as someone who's a day-to-day user of the building. It'd be more meaningful what they would see. And of course, whether you do that through a one-size-fits-all app and then different kind of filtering of functions or depth, or literally two different apps for different functions is a point of debate. But this was feedback we got from those workshops. So a few conclusions that we've drawn from this work. So firstly, I'd say that this co-design approach did offer us some very useful insights as a project team, things that we wouldn't have realized if we hadn't done it. But also that it was very valuable linking the workshops with work we'd done previously to investigate the particular buildings, to understand the energy systems installed, the real data on energy usage, who was responsible for energy. So linking those things together was really powerful. We also noticed we have to be careful about what we conclude. So in terms of how representative your sample is, you do want people who are supportive of what you're trying to do, otherwise it may become a space of debate. But definitely diverse experiences and roles in terms of usage of the building is important to capture any key issues. To be a meaningful process, I think user design needs to be followed up into practice to change how you develop your tool, and that can be a challenge in research projects in terms of how they're funded and conceived of, in that you might have a plan at the outset saying you're going to do things in a certain way. The user engagement may want to send you on a different pathway. Do you have the flexibility to go on that different pathway? So that is certainly a challenge, I think, as researchers using this approach. And final reflection is about being a bit cautious about using a one-size-fits-all approach for developing this sort of tool, because what we found is that certainly different users have different needs, different contexts in which they're operating in, and so it won't necessarily work well to try and do everything with the same app, or at least you need to build in a lot of tailorability within your tool. So that's all. I'd welcome any comments and questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Andrew. We have already a few questions for you. Andrew, I'm not seeing. You're there. Sorry, I was not seeing your camera. We have already a few questions. Perhaps I could begin with my own, because I already, as you, I had a project developing an app and used gamification approaches, but my focus was engaging students, higher education students, to energy savings at home. So they participated and they were very easily engaged in the gamification process. But in your context, if I understood properly, you addressed offices and schools and mostly people working, right, in the office, and professors?
It was a range of settings, so we also had several household buildings as well, so flats in Romania as well.
And have you found different levels of engagement in the app regarding those different users, those different targets, or not?
It was each building was very specific, I suppose, in the way they engaged. They each had very different dynamics going on. So with some of the residential buildings in Romania, there were concerns around, around privacy and the sharing of data. And so I think it was one of those buildings, didn't take part in the end. So that, that was one issue there. One of our schools, it really depended upon how interested our lead contact in that school was in engaging with the project. And of course, I've not emphasized it a lot in this talk, but in terms of how the project was implemented, of course, the arrival of COVID had a massive impact, partly in terms of trying to evaluate the difference in energy consumption over time, but also in terms of how high a priority engaging with this was when you've got all manner of other things to deal with. If you're a school or if you're a health center, engaging with us in this energy project became a much lower priority for many of our case study buildings. So that, it was issues like that had the biggest issue, biggest effect upon engagement, rather than some general points around tenure. I couldn't make general claims that I think.
Okay. Devon Wimmis is asking whether participants need to understand these gamification social elements on these tools. Do you believe that they need to understand these approaches to be engaged, to participate, or not? Because they also found that information is the most interesting.
I don't know. I think, I mean, my reflection around this, it kind of links to the Combi framework in a way, is that, you know, and this is, you know, a view I've had for a while anyway, based on other projects, but information has great value when you have motivation to hear about it and act upon it. You know, gamification is there to develop and support that motivation. When we, so you know, for this work, we were engaging with a motivated group of people, and they were saying, well, give us some information. You know, I want to understand my building, I want to feel more comfortable, and this information will help me. I think the challenge is where you have people who don't have that motivation, you know, and how you can develop that. And I think, you know, the link with the panel here is perhaps quite relevant, because, you know, the link around well-being and wanting to feel comfortable or whatever in a building could provoke sustained engagement with an app, and you could use it to manage your comfort. But for many people, the link around energy, you know, and even the sort of limited financial savings you might achieve isn't going to generate sustained engagement. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's some reflection on that point.
There is another comment or question. May these apps be a novelty in the short term, but how about ensuring usage over the long time? Any plans for study over the long term? What did the co-design process bring that you would not have had otherwise?
Yeah, those were two questions, I guess, from me, Andrew, and also to say that in the Energize project, we found something very similar, that many people simply don't have access to their heating systems. And this may be a problem if we're trying to engage people towards change. So my two questions were, what did the co-design bring? And the other one was, any plans to do a long-term study?
So what did the co-design bring? It brought useful insights, I think, that highlighted a lot of the limitations of the project as it had been conceived. You know, it had been conceived as a kind of one-size-fits-all tool for multiple types of building, and the challenge that those sessions highlighted is that actually, if you offer a tip, try doing this, it may not be applicable or useful for huge amounts of people for lots of different reasons. Either they don't have the relevant system in their building, or they do have it and they don't have any control over it. And so on. And equally, the vision of the project to link a tool like this to the kind of monitoring systems that could feed in was hugely difficult. You know, the problems we had around getting some standard kit installed in these buildings that would feed data in, you know, and this was a project that had budget to install the kit. You know, in most real life situations, you're working with what's there already. So there are real limitations, I think, around following this approach. In terms of the longer term around, seeing about sustained engagement. I mean, we didn't talk about the results of engagement, but we had overall pretty poor engagement, you know, with the tool through the project, which to a fair degree will be, you know, down to the pandemic and, you know, other priorities. But I think the types of issues we highlighted would suggest that getting sustained engagement with this kind of tool is going to be very challenging for the reasons we've discussed here. It could be an initial novelty for many people, and for people with a vested interest in managing energy in a building, it could be very useful. And as I saw a comment around, you know, gamification wouldn't help me. I'd want the data. I think if it's your job to care about the energy, you don't need that. For that wider audience, would it work if framed around energy? I'm skeptical. If it was a tool that would help you manage comfort and, you know, a broader well-being rationale, well maybe, but then maybe you lose a lot of the energy benefits. So we certainly haven't proven a viable concept, in my view, through this work so far, but we're still looking at the data and trying to make sense of it. So I wouldn't say that definitively.
For this final part, we are entering the final discussion, so we would like everyone to raise comments and questions that all of us could discuss. Khalitsa, Tim, Jenny, could you please turn your cameras on? There are some comments from the chat in Wova. Noam Bergman, Sarah Darby are saying that, okay, bringing gamification into some context may not be useful, maybe in fact a distraction. And Devon Wemis is saying that, okay, perhaps information and motivation are not always aligned, and we should perhaps pay more attention to motivation and not only to providing information, if I understood it properly. But anyone wants to comment those comments? Sorry for the repetition.
I might also jump in if in trying to think about these three different presentations, it struck me that somehow we're talking about communities, right? Communities that exist with the Library of Things, communities that we try to create maybe through these apps, and communities that we sort of latch onto when we try to find certain groups of people who are willing to do tours and others. And so it made me think of this idea of communities of practice and how some forms of learning are done in groups, or can be better or more appropriate to group settings. So I don't know, Andrew, maybe it's less relevant for your talk, as I assume it's individuals using an app, but maybe, you know, groups could be encouraged to use these apps. So I just wanted to hear from all of you on this question of whether we should be seeking out existing communities and sort of then bringing to those communities messages about energy or experiences around energy to go more in the direction of experiential learning that Jenny was talking about. So I don't know, just any comments on community building in relation to energy sufficiency and well-being, maybe.
But I was thinking, if we comparing our three presentation, I think that they in a way show the need of different ways to approaching people. And I was thinking about Andrew's, yes, of course, gamification, perhaps it in early research haven't shown any good results, but I'm thinking that I think that there are a community or a group of people that really will be intrigued on this. And even if they are now using their gaming on other things than energy, I definitely think this could be one way to approach them, because as we see now also during these times that the electricity becomes more and more integrated into everything we are doing, even eceee, this conference, we have to use electricity even to meet. And then I think it's important that we don't leave any group behind. And then I actually think that we have three nice presentation that shows that we need to have this kind of diversity, and perhaps this with games and gamification is in a more early phase, but I definitely think that's the future as well.
Thank you, Jenny. Other comments?
I just want to engage with this idea of are we talking about existing communities and engaging with communities that are already established and identify as ones? Or are we talking about a kind of new emerging communities? And taking the example of the Library of Things, I definitely think that we're talking about a community in the making. So a community which is being created around this community-based model for borrowing that the Library of Things is trying to create in different pockets in London. And particularly one of the things that I didn't mention in my presentation, but it's discussed in the paper, is that there seems to be a difference between the majority of people who were quite comfortable in borrowing things and getting on with things, and energy demand wasn't a problem, and a small percentage of people who didn't borrow because, and to use one of the quotes, they just didn't know whether they're using a carpet cleaner was going to put another fiver on their meter. And they knew that it wasn't going to be that effective to clean the carpet by hand, but I did it by hand. And the point here is that if we don't highlight, you know, if we don't kind of contribute towards more evidence for addressing the narrowness in which we talk about energy demand, and we don't kind of highlight the invisibility of energy demand in borrowing, we're risking of reproducing a model that works for middle class people. And currently they're moving away from using volunteers. So we wouldn't even capture those who participate in the model, but they can't borrow because of financial reasons. So we shouldn't make borrowing something that works only for people who can probably afford to buy the thing. We should really talk about diverse communities, because London, as in some of the big places, big cities, very diverse. And, you know, a model for borrowing should work for across different classes and income groups. So I'm quite happy to engage further on any discussions about justice, because if we're talking about what kind of science we contribute to and what kind of understanding of energy demand we want, this surely is one where it gives us an opportunity to talk about those who otherwise not be captured, which is also an interesting thing when you talk about gamification, because you capture only certain type of people.
Anyone else wants to comment? We have further questions coming in.
Like just quickly, so I think, you know, one common dimension of gamification platforms is that community aspect, isn't it? If you think of things like Fitbit, you know, that kind of helps sustain motivation for people to exercise and what have you, or kind of fitness trackers. You know, you can challenge your friends, you can kind of report on what you're doing with your peers and what have you. And so a natural thing to do with an energy app is to do that for people who share the same space and consume energy together. And that was the thing we didn't do in the project. We had the idea around it. We were building upon research that recognized that there were communities within buildings, you know, who share a space and what have you. And so that was one of the things that wasn't picked up upon. I linked to a comment that my colleague Richard Bills put in the chat around, you know, there's a wider challenge that I think he's doing a presentation later that he'll pick up on around how some of the insights we might offer around the kind of social dimensions of energy use and engagement. When you're in a collaborative project with predetermined ideas of how you're going to do something, or people coming at it from a different perspective, maybe focused more on the technology, those ideas may not be received or understood. So that's another kind of, you know, yeah, dimension to our work. I think that, yeah, it's worth flagging up, but Richard will expand upon that in another session.
Tomorrow morning, if I understood properly, panel 4, session 4, 10:30. Richard's presentation. We have a question from John Rowlatt. If gamification and engagement created by this route are challenged, is this an argument for more technocratic solutions via black box controls and third-party regulatory control? Question for all of you, I think. Who wants to take that question? No one?
Yeah. Maybe the one on, Nathalie is asking an interesting question on giving materiality to electricity, that perhaps this is something common between the different presentations. Energy is invisible, but somehow all of your projects are about manifesting energy through things, whether it's through visiting structures or through borrowing objects. So this materiality dimension seems perhaps interesting how to make energy tangible somehow. Any reactions to that?
Yes, and I think that actually relates to the other question on automation, and I think that is an interesting issue, because that is coming back to us all the time. How much do we need to motivate and engage, and how much is behavior, and how much can we actually leave to the technology? And I think that it could be rather problematic that we don't see that both those solutions are needed. I really think that we should try to go for automation when that is possible. I don't want to think about when to turn on my washing machine or whatever it will be. That can an app do for me, but we cannot only go for that, because in the end that will end up with that we become even more distant to our energy consumption. And it do matters that we engage and reflect upon that, because how we consume will actually in the end also have influence on on climate change and emissions and all that that we all know about. But if we let people be too ignorant, so to say, to the system, then I think we have left the whole development to the professionals. I think that's why I also think we need to have people stay engaged, and I think that we need to find different ways to do that. But with that, I think still that we could find parallel systems with automation as well. I think that is important, actually.
Could I build on Jenny's comment? I mean, I've not done research on this, but I'm conscious that, you know, there's more at play here than just efficiency, and a sense of control and agency, I think, is associated with both greater tolerance of conditions, you know, thermal comfort or otherwise, and perhaps the panel theme, you know, greater sense of well-being as well. So it's not so simple as doing the most efficient thing. I think empowering people has value in and of itself, or has, you know, is a means to an end to other things of value. So yeah, it's not straightforward, I think, but I would also agree that in many circumstances, greater automation that takes the thinking out of it and enables efficiency, if it doesn't undermine well-being more widely, could be useful.
Yeah, and also relating back to this with energy justice, for example, I think it is in that perspective also important to have people stay engaged, but also to realize what potential there are in the technology. But then you need to have some kind of knowledge to understand how to engage. So it's a tricky question.
Anyone else want to comment? Add further comments? No one? Well, if not, I would like very much to thank you all our speakers, all our participants for this fantastic this morning of discussing well-being and people and energy consumption. We will come back, well, panel one, we'll come back tomorrow in the afternoon period, 2:30, from 2:30 to 4 p.m. So we look forward to meet you tomorrow, and thank you all. Marlene,
Many thanks to all of you, and please keep the discussions going on WOVA. It was great to hear from all of you and to get these comments from our participants. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Hope to see
Bye.
tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone.